Welcome to Crushgasm, the podcast dedicated to the highs and lows of crushes. From their first to the worst, we're going to cover them all with a cascade of characters, including our guest today, someone who spent a majority of high school on the outside looking in and super depressed. Me! Yes, I'm back again for part 3 of the Crushes That Raised Us series. It's been a minute since we started this series, but we've had yet another promotion. We've made it through the horrors and hurdles of middle school and are now onto a whole new set of highs and lows as we approach the final 4 years of childhood. Because to me, college is like adulthood, but like a purgatory version of it. So to paraphrase Miss Rodrigo, it's brutal in there. And for me, it was. Like I said, high school was spent depressed and stressed because while I headed into high school with a group of friends, they quickly and rightfully found other friends. I did not. Yes, there were kids I talked to in class, but as far as hanging out, I really only stayed with those middle school besties after 8th period was said and done. So if they were busy with other people that, let's face it, had zero interest in being around me, I was alone. Side note, this is why I love Reba so much. That show aired on Friday nights, and I usually had no plans whatsoever if that core group was dispersed among new friends. Totally not their fault. They did what they were supposed to do. They expanded their horizons. I did not. I'm just someone who has never flourished socially during her actual existence. So yes, we're talking about high school, more specifically the millennial high school experience, and it's an interesting one because unlike our elders, Gen X, we were really growing into a new version of the world via the internet, but at the same time, it wasn't as rapid as it is today. Trends weren't going like at the flash of light. We were definitely on a dial-up mode, so much so that when I sat down to write this, I realized we don't change so much in high school. We sort of just heighten ourselves based on information we've previously learned when it comes to being cool, a sense of self, and sex. In middle school, we focused more on what was cool to point us in a clear crush direction, but in high school, it's more about who is cool. And in the early 2000s, that was broken up into 2 categories: popular cool and rebellious cool, meaning that those were traditionally cool, like the jocks and cheerleaders, those that shopped at the cream of the crop of traditional cool back then. Stores like Abercrombie & Fitch and Hollister had that California cool vibe, as well as those who were fully embraced in the hip-hop culture. Was there anyone cooler than someone rocking rockaware back then? No. On the flip side were the cool kids that would never admit to being cool, the kids that made up the typical Hot Topic shopper, punks, and emo kids, those that were too cool for school but ultimately were cooler because they didn't care, those people that were definitely the Pete Wentz and Gerard Ways of their school ecosystems. For example, the cool emo kids were the trends, while the other kids listening to the likes of The Used and all those other bands who were lower on the social ladder were like the Darias. See the difference there? Ari and Trent were just one of the many couples millennials started to mirror in their real-life romantic situations because middle school dating is kind of whatever. It's mostly hand-holding and whatnot. Well, for millennials, if we can get real wild for a second, Degrassi wasn't pulling storylines out of thin air, but in reality, high school is when relationships are more developed and have more stakes because you're getting to an age where you think you're grown and approach grown things like drama and sex, like on Dawson's Creek. Which shows like Dawson's Creek and the OC really painted teen life as the ultimate drama-rama, when really most people are just making their lives way more insane than they should be. Like, was it really that big a deal that Jeff went to a football game instead of hanging out in Lisa's garage with her and her gaggle of girlfriends on a Friday night? No, but when you're 16, that's a hell yes. Teen dramas, especially during the late 90s and early 2000s, were not only peak television, but essential to how millennials viewed how to go about their current lives, from how they dressed, to how they spoke, to how they dated. They taught us what to look for in relationships, much like the teens and tweens up in Canada did when we were in middle school, but with the new level of so-called maturity, because let's be real, Dawson looked 35, not 17. Those shows also put it into too many people's heads that love can and should be found in homeroom by the time you're a junior. If not, what's the point of life? This led to a lot of cute high school sweethearts, but way more high school heartbreaks. Also, Summer and Marissa Cooper were living like 1% of teens at the time who could relate to that. But the OC did help push the California cool popular kid aesthetic previously mentioned that was sold in mass via Abercrombie and Hollister. Fashion aside, let's go back to the OC as a whole for a second, because Seth Cohen is someone I'd put on the millennial crush collective Mount Rushmore. He's what a lot of women who were just love-struck teens at the time felt was the perfect partner, because he, in a lot of ways, was the cross-section of the two cool groups. As dorky as they wanted him to appear, he was a gorgeous boy in an array of preppy clothes, but he didn't strive to be cool. He stayed in his dorky-ass lane that was paved with comic book pages and Death Cab for Cutie tickets. The Hannah Montana of our time, truly. So as you can see, it wasn't always so black and white. For some traditionally popular kids, they crossed those emo lines and vice versa. It wasn't so strict like I think in the 80s for Gen X when John Hughes was like, if you do this, you're a jock. If you do this, you're a burnout. Like, no, we had some room to play around, but we still had two distinct lines. Outside of pop culture though, what was driving the crushes was yet again hormones, because while those were popping off in middle school, they were settled in a bit more by high school. Yet there was still a lot of growing up that needed to be done. However, there were people exploring these new territories, and when you mix that with a crush, you're going to explore people who are willing to go the distance with you in that regard. So the possibility and likelihood of actually having sex had a lot more to do with not necessarily crushing on someone, but people of sexual interest, which led many to situationships long before we even had that term. It also made for a lot of counterfeit crushes in many ways. Did you like them for them, or did you just like the fact that they were willing to have sex with you? In this regard, if middle school was the wild, wild west of hormones, high school was an all-out war, because while the millennial male was celebrated for his budding sexual activity, their female counterparts were not. The double standard was a biatch to deal with and was quite confusing even at the time for those of us who could recognize how unfair it was, but still we were stuck participating in it. You'd see a girl with a lot of male interest, and despite being a student of the Spice Girls Girl Power University, you still looked at those girls with a side eye. In hindsight, not because you felt they were the promiscuous girls Nelly Furtado sang of, but because you were likely jealous. Trust me when I say Mean Girls was not just a movie, it was very real back in the day. But for some reason, Mean Girls were a prized thing to crush on, and hey, what a strange time we lived in, and currently live in, really. So as we wrap up our walk down the hallways of high school memories, let's recap really quick. Disney and boy bands let us feel fantastical in elementary school, while middle school was strictly run on coolness and chaotic hormones. Now with high school, we kept it cool, but elevated it a bit. We also took in way too much teen drama on television, whether near the creek or the beaches of Orange County, and for some, the possibility of sex led to crushes that had ulterior motives in some cases. That's it for the Crushes That Raised Us Part 3. Tune in next time as we enter the hellscape that is adulthood, which for some meant college, but for others meant the real world, in which Matchbox 20 tried to warn us about, and we did not listen. In the meantime, you can find all of Crushgasm's information below, and until next time, as always, keep crushing it.
Crushgasm is part of the I Did Not Make These Rankings podcast network, along with some other pretty cool shows, including An Evening at the Movies, Crime Rewind, Literature Reapers, Love is Black, Masturbators, Men Are the Prize, Season to Season, The Sip List, and Toontastic Journeys. You can go to idnmtrpodcastnetwork.com to find not only Crushgasm, but all of the aforementioned really cool podcasts. Alrighty.